Hi, I'm Stanley Goldberg, host of the Inquiring Mind podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you're new here, I release 2 episodes a week with a variety of fascinating guests, and I would appreciate if you would support my podcast by liking this video and subscribing down below. Thank you for your support, and now to today's guest. Richard Rhodes, welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. It's been a hell of a journey to get you on the podcast. It's so I'm happy we could finally get to do this before the year is over. So before we get into, you've written 26 books as we discussed before hopping onto this podcast. There's a lot to discuss, different topics and all that, but I wanted to start with a little bit of an unusual book that you wrote, a book that maybe you're not best known for. And that book is called A Hole in the World. Um, I bought a used copy somewhere on the internet because when we were talking on the phone, you mentioned that your brother's name was Stanley as well,
Yeah,
and you had a quote that stayed in my mind for the next week because I kept thinking about it. And you said, uh, I like that name because it was my brother's name because he saved my life. And
right.
that's a big statement. And
It,
I thought for a second that it might have been hyperbole or whatever it might have been. But then I looked it up and I was blown away. And then I had to get a copy of your book and read the book. And it's astonishing. So what would you say uh, a difficult early life taught you and how you kind of overcame that to become the successful writer that you are now?
well, it gave me an intense drive to want to live a very different way and in a very different life than the one that had blighted part of my childhood. But inevitably, it made me an early expert on violence and terrorism, if you will. My stepmother, in beating us, starving us, putting us out to work, sending us out into the cold on weekend days with a hard boiled egg in our pockets, told us don't come home till dinner, uh, prepared me to understand how violence is perpetrated upon people in the world. And it's a very primitive system, and it's not different really from one level of violence to another. I mean, her ultimate goal was simply to enslave us. She wanted to put money together to open a store, and she used us as laborers in various ways and saved for us, as she put it, the money that we made, working on weekends, shoveling snow, working in people's gardens, whatever kind of work we could find. So people, well, let me phrase this differently. One of the things I've discovered in writing about scientists is that they all typically had some formative experience early in their life that led them to the work they did. Just to take one example, Leo Szilard, a great Hungarian scientist who was the co-inventor of the nuclear reactor along with Enrico Fermi, among many other things, uh, read a famous Hungarian epic in Hungary as a child that was about the time in the future when the sun would begin to burn out. And it really impressed him as an 8-year-old. And it was kind of a national epic in Hungary. And he formed a desire to save the world and learned as he went along, still a boy, that there would not be enough energy in chemical rocketry to move people and large amounts of matter from one place to another. So he became interested in nuclear physics,
Mhm.
which just then in the 1912s and 20s was at its richest early period of development. And then he became the one who, in 1933, almost discovered nuclear fission. But fortunately for the world, since the United States hadn't come close to being involved in it yet, but Germany had just come under the leadership, if we may call it that, of Adolf Hitler. Uh, he started looking at elements at the wrong end of the periodic table. He started with hydrogen. If he'd started with uranium, he would have found nuclear fission. And Lord knows what the world would have been, presumably a fascist world run by the Nazis with nuclear energy, nuclear weapons as
Mm-hmm.
their controlling force. So he was someone who was shaped by this early, powerful, formative experience. And over again, one finds that. My latest book, Scientist, about the biologist Edward O. Wilson, E.O. Wilson, Ed, as a boy, was kind of a Huck Finn, going out barefoot into the woods down in Alabama where he was living, and was formed in part by the fact that he lost an eye to a fishing accident and then was congenitally hard of hearing. He really had to choose some natural object that was small enough and he could find on the ground nearby to be his research subject, and it became ants. Later on, he was the one who figured out how ants talk to each other.
Yeah.
No one had worked out before. So again and again, but usually before one is 12 years old, you find formative experiences. And for better or for worse, mine was personal experience with violence and domination. And that's basically what I've written about in every book I've written.
Right. And but for those people you just described, it seemed like their formative experience was that of reading something or finding a bit of information and going into a field that they sort of read about. E.O. Wilson was very fascinated by, the outdoors, and obviously with the eye, he had to focus on ants and kind of made a whole career out of it. Obviously,
Yeah.
um, what was your moment, I guess, that you decided that I want to be a writer?
It kind of evolved because as a teenager, I was living in Independence, Missouri, in a boys' home, semi orphanage, where my brother, courageous, going to the police when he was being beaten one day by our stepmother with a fungo bat, and grabbed the bat out of her hands and seriously considered beating her. But instead, because he was imbued with already reading philosophy and things like that at the age of 13, and also because we actually just happenstance had been to the local police station a few weeks earlier to get a license for our bicycles, put all this together and went to the police rather than using violence himself, which would have been a totally different course for him and therefore for me. So he went to the police and they recognized his need. He was bruised and he was obviously starved. Years later, when I met the social worker who handled our case, when I was 18 and was being disconnected from being a ward of the court, she said, "We didn't know what to do with you boys. After all, you had two parents, which was which was the standard for child abuse in those days."
Mhm.
She said, "But you were so obviously starved." So Stanley's saved my life, I think, quite literally, in the sense that I was already half crazy. I mean, I was drawing rockets in a Big Chief tablet all day in school, obsessed with the conviction that if I made the drawing perfectly somehow, that I was drawing a little cockpit in the rocket. This was long before real rockets. Uh, and I would draw a little tiny person in the cockpit. That was me as a 4-year-old, or rather a fourth grade child, obsessed with the belief that if I got the drawing perfectly, I would literally be able to go to another place in that rocket. Well, who knows where that would have led? Maybe it would have led to a Lee Harvey Oswald. I don't know. I
Yeah.
think it would have led to violence, and I think it would have led to serious violence. My using it, having written about the development of violence in individuals since then, I now understand how people become violent and you start by being dominated by a violent dominator. So I think Stanley really did save my life, either literally in the sense that I didn't die as a result of this situation we were in, or more metaphorically in the sense that I was turned toward a really healing place, the Drum Institute for Boys, now the Drum Farm for Children in Independence, Missouri, left in the endowment of a local wealthy cattleman and banker, uh, empowered us every day. I mean, one of the features of abused children is that they feel helpless, don't know how they can get out of the situation they're in. But drum in so many ways. We grew our own food. We processed our own food. We did 4-H and FFA and church and scouting. Both Stanley and I became Eagle Scouts in the course of time. And every day was an achievement of some kind, even as simple as that we all had chores to do. And my chores for the first 2 years there was scraping the chicken shit off the chicken roosts that was left there after sleeping there at night. But it was work, and it was good work, and you could be proud of it. And later on, you progressed to feeding cattle and feeding sheep and plowing and harvesting, putting up grain, putting up hay, all the work on a farm that was still in many ways a general farm, not like the specialized farms today. So by the time I was a senior in high school, I had come to believe that I should become a Methodist minister. And I thought about it later. Why did I go that route? Well, I was trying to be a good boy. That was part of it. But more than that, I had gotten into reading Albert Schweitzer, who was in those days well-known kind of saintly figure, a man who had been one of the great organists of Europe as a younger man and had had his own transition into wanting to become someone who helped people, changed over his entire career, went to medical school, became a doctor at a mission in Africa that he founded. So that was the only context of philosophic thinking, if you will, about life in the world and how things are put together and how life works that I had encountered within the context of Methodism. So I saw that as therefore the logical way to go. And by the time I was a senior in high school, I had qualified as what's called a local preacher's license in the Methodist Church. I had delivered a few sermons, was qualified to baptize, didn't actually do any of that, but was also really conflicted because I didn't quite feel entire. But the writing kind of began then. I mean, writing sermons. I also was dating a girl, I thought, who lived 75 miles away and therefore was totally inaccessible. I couldn't access her by phone. I had no way to get to see her. I wrote her 400 letters in 1 year, meaning I wrote her more than one letter a day. So I really must have had to work pretty hard to come up with something to say in all those letters. Unfortunately, they're lost. I would love to see them today and see what they said. But in these ways, and then I had the great good luck to be living in a community, Kansas City, Missouri, where there was a locally funded and locally supported scholarship to Yale available for men in those days, boys. Uh, you didn't have to qualify on the national level. The competition wasn't national the way some of the famous scholarships are. It was simply you had to be a resident of Kansas City, and we used one of my aunts as my mailing address, and you had to get in. Well, it's a lot easier to get in than it is to beat everyone else in a national competition. I got in. I remember later the chairman of the Yale Schools Committee said, "Well, we knew you were bright, but we weren't sure you were literate," which is ironic considering what I do for a living now. In any case, I won, and I won at an extraordinarily lucky level. The scholarship originally had been set up for people who could not afford to go to college. They actually had to break the will many years before I arrived on the scene in order to extend it to people who could afford to go to some college. They just couldn't afford to go to Yale. I was evidently the only one who was literally someone who couldn't afford to go to college at all. I left Drum with $200 in my pocket from raising a couple hundred chickens that I sold to my school teachers for friars. Uh, so 4 years of all expenses paid in one of the great universities of America. It was a totally transformative experience. And one of the things I picked up very quickly was that I wasn't really sincerely and deeply religious, and I didn't have what's called a calling. That philosophy, which I had as a freshman at Yale, would give me the same arena for writing and thinking as theology would, as preaching would. And I kind of jettisoned all the religious superstructure at that point and just simply went to learn how to read and write and think.
How there's just so much to
Yeah,
unpack in that story, but for someone in a difficult situation at the moment, whether it be um, in their work environment, home life, whatever it might be, at different ages, people go through trials and tribulations in their life. One, if they knew your story, I think it's very inspirational to see somebody. um I don't want to say rags to riches, but it almost strikes me as a story like that.
yeah.
What advice would you give to a person that's going through something, a difficult time in their life?
Well, let me just say, first of all, there is enormously more resources available to children or young people who are in these situations than there were. The first medical paper on child abuse was published in a journal of radiology in 1946. 1946. Before that, it was a paper about an infant that had come to the hospital with strange twisting fractures of its legs because someone had twisted its legs until the bones broke. And the physician who wrote the paper, I looked it up, really had to be very careful in the way he described it. He didn't want to say, this is child abuse. So he simply described the injury and said, as if someone. It, so by 1949, when my brother went to the police, there really wasn't much around. The Drum Institute as a place to be able to go was just absolutely wonderfully fortuitous for us again. The sheer luck of being in the right place at the right time.
Mm.
But since then, when I published A Hole in the World, my wife and I, who helped me with the book, she's a psychologist, uh, I received probably 200 to 300 letters from people with stories, many of them much worse than mine. And Ginger and I, decided that we would, as we traveled around the country doing magazine work, and she would help me with that. She had been trained in radio journalism and she handled the mic and so forth. Uh, we would stop off long enough to interview anyone in that city whose letters had been particularly interesting. So we collected 20 extensive interviews among the people who wrote and did a book, which was titled Trying to Get Some Dignity. A phrase that one of the people we interviewed had used about how he'd spent his whole life trying to get some dignity. One thing that everyone had in common who had survived was they had help. They had some kind of model. They had someone who had intervened in their lives, sometimes really peripherally. There was a really beautiful woman whose mother had been really a sadistic torturer. But walking down the street one day as a little girl, someone had passed them by and stopped and said, "What a beautiful little girl." And she clung to that through all this terrible time in her childhood as something that was different from what she was learning every day from her mother. There was another woman who, a policeman had come to school to give one of those police talks and had been involved in art in some way in school and helped her with learning to paint or draw. And that had been enough for her. So, and of course, there were much more elaborate interventions like the one Stanley and I experienced, that there was really a more salvation, if you will. These were often people who had not achieved what they'd hoped to in their life. So I think the important point, and especially when one hears the financially successful bragging about how they did it all themselves, the fact is nobody does it all himself. And especially when you're in those circumstances, someone intervenes, someone helps. Later on, I got to know and correspond with the psychoanalyst who wrote the book Soul Murder, which is an extraordinary book about people who go through lives like this. He calls the experience of this kind of mistreatment soul murder, as if someone had murdered your soul. And he had treated people who had not successfully moved on. And again, it was because they'd had no intervention, they'd had no help. They'd had to shoulder the whole burden themselves. So, I mean, the credit goes to those decent human beings who step in and and act when they see something that needs attention. And it may not be easy. You can't just walk up to some bully and say, stop hitting your child. But there are ways, and fortunately more and more there are institutionalized ways. The Drum Institute had a real problem in the 1980s and 90s because the prevailing training of social workers in the social welfare system was that any institution like the Drum, where people lived collectively, if you will, we were four to a room in an old, wonderful old farm building that had been around since just after the Civil War, and we were all living collectively. That had been spurned as something that was bad in place in preference for uh, I'm sorry, I'm blocking on the name for the kind of the homes that children are taken into these days.
An
What is
orphanage?
the phrase? No, not orphans, but individual children. There are couples who take in children and raise them as if they
Oh,
were their,
foster care.
yeah, foster homes. Thank you.
Yeah.
In favor of foster homes. It turns out that foster homes have really bad psychological profiles for children, not because the homes are necessarily bad, but because the children inevitably are moved around all over the place all the time. And drama, well, by then I was on the board. We had the problem that they wouldn't let us take these children where we could provide a continuity over. I mean, I was at Drum 6 years. Other children since then have been there as long as 12, have arrived as 6-year-olds and stayed all the way through high school, really become a part of that life and that family. And well, anyway, to make the long story short, the solution was the Drum reorganized itself as a collection of group homes, which could benefit from the endowment of the institution and from its greater gathering power, if you will, for resources, while still living in what was essentially a collection of foster homes all on one campus. But times change. And my point is this place, this kind of institution, and even foster homes, when the children aren't constantly moved around, are a wonderful solution to a problem that still exists, which is that the family is the one political unit left, which is still, if you will, private. It's very hard to get inside a family legally. You really have to have serious evidence of serious abuse. And even then, the custom now and the belief now, I don't know that it's particularly supported scientifically, is that the best place for children is with their family. Well, it wouldn't have been the best place for my brother and me, that's for sure. And I think it would not be the best place for many children.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
still a problem and it hasn't really found a solution. We don't want the state intervening in our private family lives. But there's some way to fix all that. And I have quite a few ideas about it that we don't need to go into. But there is an evolution in the
Yeah.
direction of better care all around.
What I found interesting in this, and I do intend on pivoting towards some of the books you've written over the years. This is just incredible, one of those like incredible stories that you hear about and want to highlight because, um, a lot of people know your book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, books about nuclear energy. And one of my favorites is Masters of Death, which I do want to ask a few questions about, which is a superb book.
But you see
Um,
how my subject matter focuses on violence.
yeah,
I'm an expert, I guess.
on violence. Yeah, but
Ironically,
but you mentioned earlier on that when your stepmother was beating Stanley with a bat, correct? He took it away from her and thought about maybe retaliating. And
yeah,
he was reading philosophy. You said that he at the time he was reading philosophy. He was what, 13 years old? 12?
yes,
Thir-
yes,
13 years old. Um
right.
my question is, where did he start? Why did he start reading philosophy? Where did he get it? Where did he get his hand on these books? And then the second kind of part to that question is, um when did you first fall in love with books? Because I
Uh,
think as a person that's written 26 books,
yeah.
you must find incredible utility in books. So where did that initial love come from?
Well, to answer the second question first, very early age, partly because Stanley was reading. Stanley is was a year and a half. He's deceased now, sadly. Uh, Stanley was reading and shared his comic books, which in those days were considered to cause you to become violent or insane. That's another story that I find amusing. Anyway, and we were living in a boarding house. My mother committed suicide when I was a baby. I mean, the reason my father married my stepmother is because he had raised us by himself in boarding houses for about, 7 or 8 years, living in one room with two boys, never having a private life except when he went off mysteriously on Saturday afternoons, dropped us off at the movies, and I suppose went off to get laid, presumably. Uh, but anyway, uh, we were living in a boarding house that was operated by a German couple. And Mrs. Gernhardt, who was just a wonderful classic German matron who did all the cooking and made great food and took care of everything, taught me to read when I was 4. I mean, I had a high IQ. I was a bright child. And I picked it up when I was 4. And as soon as I got going, here was a whole universe. And the answer to where did I get it? The wonderful public library system in the United States in those days. It's not quite what it was, but even little kids could go to the library and check out books. Although I once tried at the age of 7 or 8 to check out an adult science book and was told by the librarian it was too old for me, and I was just incensed. I knew damn well it wasn't too old for me. I could read that book, or at least muddle around with it. So, but anyway, I learned to read early, and it really opened up a whole universe for me. And I got the kind of training that writers traditionally got in the past, which was reading. Where else would you learn to write except by reading other people's writing? That's exactly what I did all through childhood, with a curious bent towards science that I think had much to do with the fact that I was really dazzled by the atomic bomb, not surprisingly. I was 8 years old in 1945. most of my childhood had been the Second World War. One of my earliest memories is Pearl Harbor, going from door to door in our neighborhood in Kansas City, knocking on the door. And when people came to the door saying, the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor, and then everybody would scramble and run around and turn on radios. It was the most powerful kind of experience for a little kid. So when I learned that the bomb, as was supposed then, ended the war, forced the Japanese to surrender, I was suddenly struck in a deep way, again, thinking of Szilard's story, by how powerful science must be. If you could build something that could end a war that had consumed my childhood in good ways, but also in dark ways. On every block, someone had a mourning flag in the window with a gold star on a black felt background, which indicated someone in their family had been killed in the war, as well as the fact that the streets were basically empty of cars and we could play in them because nobody could get tires and nobody could get gasoline. They were all rationed. We couldn't get bubble gum either, which was a great tragedy for us. And so that's when I began to be interested in science. I began to read the superb science reporting that was in Life magazine in those days.
Mm.
They would give experiments and talk about it and all. And I used to clip the articles, stick them in a big cornflakes box, take them to school, and bore my classmates in show and tell time by explaining what an atom was, and what the nucleus was, and what nuclear fission was, and so forth. So, it was a logical progression up through childhood with books. And Stanley was a great reader too. But as I say, one of the ways I learned to read from him, once Mrs. Gernhardt got me going with the basics, was that we read comic books, which were just marvelous. In those days, they were bloody and wonderful. And they got emasculated by some psychiatrist in the 50s who made all these claims about they caused children to be violent and so forth. And the comic book industry just took out all the violence all of a sudden. And they got to be really boring. So kids like bloody stuff,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well,
So that's the way it progressed.
so you won your Pulitzer Prize for that book, the making of the atomic bomb. Um, I'm still making my way through it. It's a
Page book.
it's a thicker book. I'm enjoying it. I'm taking it slowly. I'm taking notes. There are a lot of characters that I want to remember and do the same kind of version of what you did at show and tell and just
That's
come up to people and be like, well, did you know?
right. Yes.
But it doesn't, again, still strike me as a natural progression to be, love reading, and grew up on books, but then you're so fascinated by nuclear energy. Wouldn't the natural transition then be to become a scientist, or to go into uh you know to become a nuclear physicist, or whatever it might be?
Yeah.
But instead you wrote a very popular and accessible book about nuclear energy to the general public. Why did you go the book route rather than the I guess the science route?
Yeah. No, because my education didn't prepare me. I didn't have any math, and that's one of the fundamentals of doing science.
Mhm.
Uh, I mean, in high school at the boys' home, we went to school half days and took what were called solids, history and English and so forth. And then we went back to the Drum Institute and took vocational agriculture, which was studying agriculture in various ways and also working on the farm, uh, which in many ways was a marvelous education for a writer. I think I got more out of vocational agriculture than I ever would have out of a more academically oriented high school program. I mean, after all, I was reading like crazy. I was consuming 7 novels a week. I shouldn't say novels. I was consuming 7 works of science fiction a week. And then when I discovered popular historical fiction that it had sex scenes in it at about the age of 14, I switched immediately to,
Mm.
to historical fiction. And I mean, that's getting pretty close to what I ended up writing. But I really was not prepared, certainly not when I got to
Right.
Yale to study science in a serious way, especially because I had no math. So I found another slot which let me be close to science and learn about science, but not actually do it. Sometimes I've been disappointed that I wasn't capable or able or prepared to go into being a physicist. I think it would have been great fun. I know it would have been great fun. I've met a lot of wonderful physicists and who've told me about their work and how very special it is to find something that no one's ever found before, to get another little piece out of the puzzle about the natural world.
Right.
But I love what I do and I love the work I do. And it took me a long time to get over feeling like a fraud because I've discovered that if you learn the language of a professional field, people in the field will assume you know the field when all you actually know is the language. In other words, it's about an inch deep.
Yeah.
I think I've gone deeper than that when I was writing The Making of the Atomic Bomb. Again, Kansas City happens to have one of the great science libraries in America, the Linda Hall Library of Science. And I went there. This was pre-internet, of course. These days, it's much simpler to do research because you can find almost everything online. Serious documentation for most kinds of research is there waiting for you. Uh, I went to the Linda Hall Library and they had, because of the way their collection had been assembled, they had all the original papers in nuclear physics all the way back to the discovery of the nucleus. And I was able to read through those papers. Luckily, nuclear physics is primarily experimental. There's very little mathematical work in it, at least that you need to comprehend. You can read a description of a laboratory experiment. This metal box was evacuated and set on a table, and a piece of cotton went into one end and a little piece of radioactive material, and then at the other end, blah blah blah, a little detector. So you could follow physically and grasp, therefore, the experiment that way. And also, as a writer describing what happened, I could describe the experiment in a way that the reader could follow, whether they knew physics or not, with a certain amount of minimal jargon and understanding of what was going on. So I don't think I could. I've been told I could not have managed that had I dealt with particle physics. And ironically, I'm right now working on a book about the Large Hadron Collider, the largest machine in the world in Switzerland and France, and also the history of particle physics. But I think I've reached a point where, with enough coaching by some friends, I can probably describe that much as I did nuclear physics.
Hmm.
That's the
Uh,
goal, anyway. We'll see.
yeah. So when you were younger and growing up, obviously, you just mentioned that one of your, um, you know, kind of original memories was of Pearl Harbor, and then the war ending because of nuclear weapons, and then we went through the Cold War period where nuclear weapons were very prominent. Kids had to, uh, had drills to, go under their desks and, do all that stuff as if that was going to work. Um, and now you kind of don't hear as much about nuclear weapons. I think we've entered a new kind of war of cyber wars
Yeah.
and all that. So, do you think that nuclear weapons still play a major role in foreign
Oh,
affairs, or they're not
absolutely.
they're not that important?
Absolutely. In fact, it's appalling that they have fallen off the table. I remember looking up what were the main concerns Americans had, what fears they had back in the middle of the Cold War, and nuclear weapons were number one. Now they're number 25. Number one is like street violence or something to do with personal violence. And way, way down the list are nuclear weapons, which is they're still there. The missiles are still waiting in their silos. The bombs are still loaded on planes. And like all machinery, the risk is there of accident or malfeasance. We have not escaped the dangers of the Cold War just because we don't have a Cold War going anymore. Uh, and more to the point, perhaps they profoundly affect international relations. They do so because countries that have them are basically safe from attack by other non-nuclear powers and probably by nuclear powers as well. The so-called deterrence, I don't think, is as sophisticated as the mandarins who invented the theory in order to build more bombs have said over the years. But on a fundamental existential gut level, we all understand, certainly our governments understand. Maybe Donald Trump didn't understand, but he was eventually enlightened, uh, that you can't use the damn things. And if you can't use the weapons, then you can't really have large scale wars anymore. One of the things that I looked up and analyzed about 1949-5 was the rapid decline of man-made death. Man-made death, meaning death from violence of various levels,
Right.
slowly increased from the 18th century uh, on the world scale up to 1943, when about 15 million human beings died, combining both World War II and the Holocaust. Then it began to drop off. And in 1945, it reached a low of about 1 million people a year in small regional conflicts. And it's stayed around there, 1 to 2 million, ever since. That's a really paradoxical fact. It
Mhm.
was increasing almost uh, exponentially prior to that. Where did it go? What led to it? I mean, did human beings all become angelic suddenly? No. The nations of the world were scared, pardon me, shitless by the fact that nuclear weapons could exist in the world and that as countries acquired them, they would basically be protected against assault by the potential for mutual annihilation. So that's, I think, why, after all these years of what one should rightly call a long peace, I mean, of course, 1 million deaths a year is terrible, and we should work to reduce them, but it's considerably fewer than die of smoking. So, in some sense, at a public health level, we found a cure, or at least a restraint, a vaccination against large scale wars. Everyone after the Second World War, all the scientists, Einstein and others, were all terrified there would be a third world war with nuclear weapons. It never happened.
Yeah.
And it never happened because of what I was just describing, I think. There are those who disagree, but I haven't seen an argument that's as convincing as the nuclear weapons argument. So what Niels Bohr, the great Danish physicist, drew out of his understanding of where these bombs would take us. This curious paradox of a more peaceful world, but one constantly hovering on the brink of annihilation, as we do today,
Mhm.
even though we've reduced our arsenals by enormous numbers. The United States has now about 8,000 nuclear weapons, the Soviet Union about 12, I mean, Russia about 12. At the height of the Cold War, Russia had 75,000. I mean, they were doing their old factory thing of crank them out as fast as you could crank them out. But exceed your quota every year, comrade, was the rule. And basically, so were we. We had to find new targets all the time because we were making more. So that's an interesting history, but we don't need to go into it. But we're in this interesting place where we've found a cure for war, but the cure for war, if it ever had to be executed, would be far worse, would be the equivalent of the extinction of the dinosaurs. I
Mhm.
think that's clear now. It's an interesting place to be, and it either says the human beings are very clever, or it says they really have to be brutally controlled in order not to knock themselves off. In the meantime, of course, the environmental changes have been sneaking in on the side and bringing us another similar, perhaps, dilemma. It's not quite clear yet, but maybe it is.
Yeah. Uh, but can you ever put the genie back in the bottle? Can we ever have a world with no nuclear weapons?
Sure. You don't put the genie back in the bottle exactly. What you do is have a world of that has deterrence on the level of knowledge. Let's say, I mean, right now, how would you reduce the threat of instant war when we have missiles with 30-minute delivery times on hair trigger alert, as do the Russians, as do other countries? How do we think about that? We think about making it a little slower before you can send them off. We think about taking the warhead off the missile and putting it in another building down the road. So it would take 30 minutes to go get it and bring it to the silo and screw it onto the rocket. Then we talk about maybe moving it a day away. So we walk back the delivery time and make it longer and longer. It's conceivable then to have a world, if it's perfectly transparent, which is to say, if you have open inspection of every country. That's been the hangup, really. Conceivable to have missiles that are basically parts in a silo, or in a warehouse somewhere, that would take 3 or 4 or 5 months to assemble. Or even in the ultimate scenario, the plans for these machines carefully stored in a vault, so that it would mean you'd have to go mine the uranium and build the rockets and do all of that. Then maybe it's a 2-year delivery time. On that level, if it were certain that somebody who tried to cheat would be found out early on before they were able to actually build some missiles, then there would be all sorts of possibilities for intervention short of nuclear war. You could start by diplomacy. If that didn't work, you could move to sanctions. If that didn't work, you could move, if you had to conventional war. But as Robert Oppenheimer described it in 1946, this is the plan that was proposed by the famous Acheson-Lilienthal Commission in 1946. And it's still the best clear idea of all. Oppenheimer was asked by the guy who was going to deliver the plan at the United Nations, well, where's your army? What do you do if someone tries to cheat? And he said, well, if someone tried to cheat, that would be an act of war, wouldn't it? If you set up a world where no one may own nuclear weapons, where it's outlawed to have nuclear weapons and inspection and those controls are all in place, then if someone starts to move toward a nuclear arsenal, that's an act of war, and you respond as you would to any act of war. Ultimately, at its worst, we would end up back with the world that we have today, with a bunch of missiles in their silos ready to go in 30 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
That, to me, is the only plan that's ever made sense. And I know there are lots of things people could ask about it, but it's doable. It was doable in 1946, except we were the only nuclear power, and the Soviet Union was not about to allow us to have a monopoly on nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
We would not have allowed that if they had been the only power. So
So
there is a solution, but it
so
requires detoxifying nuclear weapons.
right. Would it be that, for example, just to pick a country, if China would have their investigators in the United States, for example, and
Yeah,
the Americans would be in China checking up on.
we do now.
Right.
Russia has inspectors at some of our places out in Nevada and so forth, and we have inspectors in their places. We've had that for 20 or 30 years.
I know
Since,
that this sounds very simplistic, but is there any fear of them hiding facilities or?
yes, that's a concern, but the inspection, the level of inspection that has been devised over the years at many different levels in terms of the materials. Look, you cannot have a nuclear weapon without uranium or plutonium. There's no other way to build a nuclear weapon. Those are the only two materials that work. then you can expand in hydrogen bombs and so forth. But the heart of it is those metals, and they're fairly rare. And it's possible to keep track of all that stuff. In fact, we do.
Yeah.
So it's not beyond the range of human intelligence and gifts and skill to make such a world. What's lacking is the desire and the will on the part of nation states that still believe somehow their power is invested in the ownership of these weapons. When India got its nuclear arsenal started in 1998, after having tested its first bomb in 1974, and then leaving it kind of in a bomb in the basement level until Pakistan tested weapons in 1998, and then India jumped in as well, the two states being linked by their animosities.
Sure.
I forgot what I was going to say. What was I talking about? When India got its bombs. Oh, yes. When India got its bombs in 1998 and built the first arsenal, its defense minister said, well, now the big boys will have to let us sit at the table with them. And he was talking about the other aspect of nuclear weapons that's more insidious, and that is they represent a source of national prestige. And the way we tried to combat that was to develop the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty back in the 60s after the terror of the Cuban Missile Crisis, as close as we've ever come to a nuclear war, which would have been an absolute disaster all over the world. The Soviet Union and the United States decided that they better get a treaty going that will prevent what Kennedy, I remember, was talking about as the possibility of 30 or 40 nuclear powers in the world. If everyone had been allowed just to take off and build nuclear weapons, it might have come to that. But by offering a treaty that everyone signed, pretty much, a couple outlaws, but that said basically, we will give you the knowledge and skills and financial support to develop the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, meaning nuclear power, basically, if you will forego developing a nuclear arsenal, then that will be the deal. And that was the deal. And it's limited the number of nuclear powers after all these years to 9. It's not simply a matter of when you have the technology, you build a nuclear arsenal. It's a political decision. And it's a very fraught political decision. Israel has made a point of never mentioning that it has a considerable nuclear arsenal. The numbers I've seen estimated vary from 100 to 300 warheads. And they're on cruise missiles, on submarines right off the coast of Iran. That's a very potent deterrent for a very small country that's surrounded by people that would rather it weren't there. And it's guaranteed for Israel its existence all these years. Well, those are the kind of political issues that would have to be resolved in order to move beyond using deterrence at some level. But deterrence won't go away, so it's going to be deterrence, as I said, at the level of mothballed weapons, if you will. Kind of like the cannons and the forts between Canada and the United States and the northern regions of the country. And, those old cannonballs are still stacked up there, and the cannon are there. They're just not, nobody even thinks about them anymore. They're just decorative. That would be a lovely place to arrive.
How about the power of these nuclear weapons? So for a long time, I would read something like it's 50. The current atomic bomb is like 50 times what it was in Nagasaki and it's one thing to hear it,
Yeah.
but I can't wrap my head around what 50 times not Okinawa, sorry,
Right.
Nagasaki is.
Yeah.
Like I can't, it's really difficult are we talking about mainland Japan just being blown up, or is it what
No.
if you blow up an atomic weapon right now, will you drop it in the middle? What is it? How far does it go?
When we got to hydrogen weapons, we moved from bombs that could destroy cities to bombs that could destroy states. The largest weapon ever conceived was one that Edward Teller came up with that would be 1,000 megatons. That bomb, if it had ever been built, it never was, That bomb would have had a fireball 10 miles in diameter. What Teller then realized, or someone with better sense realized, was that the atmosphere is only about 10 miles deep. So if you had a 10-mile fireball, most of the explosive force would just blast out into space. So there was a limit to the utility of scaling up weapons. The largest weapon actually tested was a Soviet bomb, the so-called Tsar bomb, which they built basically, as they said later, just to show you what we could do. It was its design yield was 150 megatons, 150 million tons of TNT equivalent. They actually built one or more, and they dropped one by plane over Siberia. And it was kind of like the Tunguska meteorite that swept through Siberia back in 1908. It knocked down an enormous lot of trees and burned out a lot of an area. But again, the scale was just crazy. When Robert Oppenheimer had his security clearance withdrawn in a really nasty piece of political attack that took place in the early 50s. One of the questions he was asked at the security hearing was, because the claim was that he had prevented the development or delayed the development of the hydrogen bomb. He was asked, well, Dr. Oppenheimer, if you had had a hydrogen bomb at the end of the Second World War, wouldn't you have dropped it on Hiroshima? And Oppenheimer said, no, I would not have. Well, why not? Because the target was too small, he said. Because the target was too small. And that's kind of the case with these weapons. Why did we build all those nuclear weapons? Did we really need them? Would not one submarine or two submarines with warheads untraceable under the oceans of the world been more than enough? Yes. No question that it would have. One submarine could have taken out all of the Soviet Union or all of Europe or all of North America. They had 16 300 kiloton warheads. 300 kilotons is at least, let's see, it's 10 times the yield of somewhat more than the Nagasaki plutonium bomb. So why did we build all these? And I think the answer is fairly clear in the record. The Air Force took control of the nuclear arsenal early on. Curtis LeMay realized that whoever controls the nuclear arsenal is going to have most of the defense budget. And he worked out a kind of a bootstrapping process. Number of targets determine number of bombs. Number of bombs determine, in those days, only planes, number of planes to deliver those bombs. And number of planes in turn determines the budget. So he got control of the targeting. And by 1954, the defense budget, 47% of the defense budget was going to the Air Force. Mm-hmm. And the Navy and the Army realized that if they didn't jump on the nuclear bandwagon, they were going to fade away, because LeMay was asking for bigger bombs so these planes could carry more yield. And he had a plan to sweep all his aircraft across Eastern Europe, bombing it as he went, even though those were supposedly the people held hostage by the Soviet Union. But there were bombs there and so forth. And then bombing all of the Soviet Union. And then, just as a kind of a soupçon afterwards, go ahead and bomb China as well. That was his vision for how he would bring peace to the world. Truly insane, but there it was. But the Army started discovering that it needed nuclear weapons too. It built cannons with nuclear shells. The smallest nuclear weapon ever built weighed 51 pounds, and it was the warhead for an artillery shell. It was an elegant little bomb, but you really ran the risk that your cannon crew, your gun crew, would be destroyed when it exploded. So the Army found uses for nuclear weapons. The Navy obviously found uses for nuclear weapons and developed the whole submarine fleet. So it was, I think, inter service rivalry more than anything else that led to the enlargement of the nuclear arsenal. With the Soviets, maybe a little bit more their horror at what happened to them in the Second World War. They lost 25% of their national industrial plant. They lost 20 million people. 20 million people died in the Soviet Union in the Second World War. They were reduced to just bankruptcy after the war for a while. And they had every reason to think that we would attack them in a stealthy way, just as the Nazi Germany had attacked them in 1941. So their goal was basically to build as many weapons as they could build as fast as they could. They were slow at first. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy called their bluff about not have, they only had about 4 missiles. They pretended they had more, but the whole point in slipping missiles into Cuba, as indeed they did, was to give them the same kind of advantage as we had with warheads in Turkey, right on
Mhm.
the edge of the Soviet Union, with very short delivery times. So Khrushchev thought, well, screw them. They want to have missiles right on our borders. We'll have missiles on their borders. And Kennedy could not accept that. That would be politically annihilating for him. And so they had this very close call of a standoff. I remember vividly, we were all staring at our television sets all weekend, wondering if we were going to live to see the next week, as was Kennedy, as were people in Washington.
Mm. Wow.
Fortunately, they found their way through, but Khrushchev had to back down. And he lost his position as premier of the Soviet Union within a few years, largely because he did that. But he
Mhm.
saved the world, perhaps. So,
Wow.
yeah.
Um, I'm a little bit of a loss for words. Um, but obviously, I mentioned the fact that I was introduced to your work through a book. Again, you're known through for the most part, the books about nuclear energy, but I was introduced by this book I have right here, Masters of Death.
Yeah.
Um, I only read a chapter in college for a paper I was writing about Bobby Yar, which is a pit in by Kiev in Ukraine,
Yeah.
where I think it's the single largest massacre during World War II took place at Bobby Yar. And I had to read a chapter, and I was so enthralled by that chapter, even though it's fairly short. Um, that I decided to read the whole book. And
Oh,
so um
that's a
I-
grim experience.
yeah, I had my family is from the Soviet Union. My parents immigrated in 1996, but they um they grew up in the Soviet Union, and I grew up with these kind of stories about the difference between the Soviets and how the Soviets view the Americans, and what they were told about America. But this book is so well written, and I cannot begin to express how well written it is, because I read it and I felt like I was reading a novel, and I thought it wasn't fair that I was reading a nonfiction book, because I was learning, but it was just like, how this ends, but you keep reading because
Oh,
it's a story.
the sheer
The
horror.
the sheer horror of these battalions. But how did you why did you decide to write this book?
2 reasons. I had just written a book called Why They Kill, which was about an American criminologist named Lonnie Athens, who had, I believe, developed the first definitive causal model of how people are taught and conditioned to become violent, socialized to become violent. He had received a great deal of criticism for the book. It had been rejected by his fellow sociologists over and over again. But it made intuitive sense to anyone who had experienced violence himself, as I had. And I've noticed that, by the way, since I wrote the book, that the people who get it instantly are people who work with criminals themselves, uh, anyone who's been around violence almost always says, you got it, he got it. That's right, that's how it happens. Whereas people who have not had personal experience with violence, vividly in one experience I had with a group of psychiatrists, don't get it at all. I gave a talk at a bookstore once where there was a psychiatrist in the audience, and after I finished, he stood up and announced who he was and said, "Now let me tell you how people really become violent," as if everything I had just said had blown past him. It hadn't even registered in his mind.
Right.
And then he went through the usual explanations of this and that and the other. But I think Athens did it by interviewing about 100 violent criminals in prison all over the United States, interviewing each one to the extent of about 8 to 10 hours of interview each, taking those transcriptions. And the question was always the same. So he would start with the case of record, the one that had put them in prison. That was the way of testing their honesty. If they lied about that, then he would throw out the whole thing. Later on, when my book was reviewed in the New York Times Book Review by Joyce Carol Oates, she said these are a bunch of bullshit stories these people made up. She obviously hadn't read the book very carefully because I explained exactly his procedure for isolating the people who were lying to him. He would start with their case of record and then he'd walk them back. So what happened? What was the one behind that? What happened to you before that? Did you attack someone before that? Were you attacked before that?
Oh.
With the younger men, at least, he could walk them all the way back to their first experience with violent domination, typically by a parent or a gang member in the streets or a sibling. The context would vary, maybe in the military. The military is one of the places that people are actually taught to be violent, but limited to defensive violence so that they won't walk around shooting people. Vietnam was a classic example of a situation where it got to the point where the soldiers could no longer distinguish violent enemies from normal villagers in black pajamas, and therefore started committing atrocities because they basically leaped over into the "I'll kill anyone who walks past me" if they're wearing black pajamas and look like they're Vietnamese.
Mm-hmm.
So Athens interviewed all these people, took the transcripts of the interviews as he had laid them out, put them side by side and compared them. What do people who have this problem have in common? It's the classic way that diseases are discovered. You take people who have the disease and you look at their symptoms and signs and you try to understand what's different from people who don't have the disease. So the whole superstructure of normal sociological research, which relies on correlations between people, not causes between people, and which therefore requires large numbers of subjects in order to tease out the rather limited behavior that shows up in correlations.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody in the sociological world seems to understand the difference anymore. Athens has had to struggle with this over and over again. He was looking at people who had the condition. They had been proven to be seriously violent. What in their past, in the way of social experience with violence, did they all have in common? Because if he identified that and tested it against some other people who were often exposed to similar situations but weren't violent, such as abused women, which he did do later, this would be, for at least this set of people, the cause of their violent behavior. Every time you encountered a new violent person, you would have to test the model again because the model was only as good, causally speaking, as the people who had the disease.
Right.
So Athens went about preparing this model, and I won't go through the whole model. It's quite complicated. Fortunately, or we'd all be violent because we all have some experience of being pushed around and so forth, bullies in schools and all that. So he tested it with criminals in prison. I wanted to test it, I realized after I'd published this book about him and his work, I wanted to test it in an entirely different context. one that would not in any way resemble, you know, bicycle gangs and street gangs and people in prison because they'd killed their parents or whatever. And I came across, I don't remember how I came across the story of the Einsatzgruppen, but I do remember that I read a book called Ordinary Men,
Oh, fantastic book.
right?
I had Christopher Browning on the podcast to discuss the book.
Ah,
Yeah.
so Browning's theory is that anybody can be made violent just by being told to be violent. That's basically what he proposes in his book. No, that's simply not true.
Uh-huh.
What happens when people who are not violent are forced to use violence is they break down. What's interesting about the Einsatzgruppen is that these were men who were already conditioned to defensive violence as policemen,
Right.
as SS recruits who've been trained for combat, and to some degree as locals who were personally violent anyway. There was a great deal of personal violence in Central Europe. There still is. There's a lot of beating of children and so forth. So, and Germany too has had very high rates of children being abused over the years. They had a plague of suicides in their schools back in the 1910s and 20s because the children were being abused so badly. So there's plenty of evidence that these people were already violently socialized to a certain level. And in that context, they were then sent out behind the advancing armies of Nazi Germany when they invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, ostensibly to pacify the cities and towns as the army moved on. But part of their assignment was to kill Jews. And they started out by basically recruiting the local thugs to do their killing for them. Some horrible stories along those lines. But pretty soon they realized they were going to have to do it themselves because there was so much reaction against all this public slaughter that was going on, people being beaten to death with iron rods in the public square. So they developed a system where they would take some local prisoners of war and take them out to the edge of town and either find a tank trench or a trench or a gully of some kind, thus Babi Yar, or they would dig a trench and they would gather together the local Jews, but specifically men of military age, men between the age of about 15 and 50, who could be construed by these Einsatzgruppen, these special forces, that's what the phrase means, as enemy, as dangerous, because they had the potential to be guerrilla forces. They had the potential to become soldiers to fight the German army. And so you could justify the killing as defensive. You were protecting yourself and the people you value, meaning the people in the homeland, from these potentially dangerous people. Under those circumstances, although it wasn't easy, they would line them up on the edge of a trench and shoot them in the head. And they'd be spattered with blood and brains, and they'd see people die and everything else. But they got along reasonably well with that challenge until July, when Hitler decided that the Soviet Union was going to be knocked off by Christmas, and passed the word through Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, to start killing the women and children as well. Now we had a circumstance where these Einsatzgruppen could no longer construe the killing they were doing as defensive. It's one thing to say, I shot that man because he was going to be a soldier. But it's hard to say that about a young woman or a child or a baby.
Yeah.
And these were suddenly the people who were in that lineup on the edge of the trench that they were killing. And they began to break down. My point I made earlier about you can't just get anybody to walk out and start killing people unless at threat of their own death, and not always even then. There are people who won't use violence even if they're told they'll be killed if they don't.
Mhm.
At that point, these guys started to have problems. They weren't comfortable doing this kind of killing anymore. One solution that Himmler came up with and his people was to have nightly feasts in the local Hofhaus, and bring the men together and sing cheerful patriotic songs. And they would be told that what they were doing was important to the Fuhrer. They would be told that this interesting logic, if you don't look, you're killing the parents of these babies.
Right, right, right.
If you don't kill the babies, they will grow up to want revenge on you and they will take revenge on your children. So you must kill them now and get a clean sweep. It didn't really work. There were two kinds of killers that evolved very quickly across the next few months. One, the more common, people who had nervous breakdowns of one kind or another, volunteered to go to the Eastern Front, for Christ's sake, which is like committing suicide in those days. The SS actually opened a hospital north of Berlin as a place where these people could do some R&R and recover from these traumatic experiences they were having. Himmler was okay with that because he perceived them to be merely weak.
Mm-hmm.
But there was another kind of person who evolved, and that was someone who became fully violent, who went through all the stages of Athens' model and came out the other side as a fully violent individual who would volunteer to go find Jews to kill, who would take off after hours on their own and find Jews to kill. Himmler was horrified. Himmler was not himself a fully violentized individual. He managed to become a desk murderer. You get all the aggrandizement of being violent, and there is prestige in being violent of a sort without having to actually go around killing people. So he was able to order any number of people killed, as was Hitler, just because it was necessary. The Fuhrer wants it. So Himmler was horrified by these guys who became voluntary killers, fully malefic individuals. He said at one point, look, when he had observed one of these killings and was sickened by it, was really literally made sick by it. It was so horrible to him from his perspective. He said, we kill out of duty. To kill out of pleasure is barbaric, is savage. And we don't want that. At that point, and this is what's so important about this story that I think has not really been explained fully yet in the literature. At that point, he and his crew decided they had to find some other way of killing Jews that would be less traumatic to the perpetrators. People have always said the Einsatzgruppen, the so-called bullet holocaust, was less efficient than the gas chambers, that the death camps were invented because they were more efficient. They were an industrialized technology. They weren't more efficient. At the height of the killing, such as at Babi Yar, these guys with their guns and their bullets were killing 10 to 15,000 people a day. So they were perfectly, and the death camps at the height of their power never got to the point of knocking off more than 10,000 people a day. Babi Yar was, what, 44,700 in 2 days, using just local police and SS and rifles, stacking people in what they called sardine packing, laying them down and shooting them back of the head and having the next group lie down crosswise and shooting them in the head and building up your sardine can. I mean, it's horrible to talk about. It's horrible to write about. I had nightmares when I was writing that book. But I did want to see what happened. And I discovered that the transition to the death camps was done not because of any. So, one of the things that historians have said was modernity caused the death camps. Others have said science was responsible. No, they invented the death camps because they wanted to reduce the trauma to the perpetrators. So at the height of some of these camps, where they were the ones that were totally devoted to killing, not the concentration camps where people were brought together to use them for slave labor, which is another mix-up that people make.
Mm-hmm.
Auschwitz was both. It had a death camp where people went straight from the trains to the gas chambers. And it had another camp where people were held, healthy young men mostly, to work in the factories to Krupp and the other industrialists who were feeding the war. It's the death camps I'm talking about. Typically, they would be run by about 75 SS men and staffed with Polish prisoners, Russian prisoners, anyone they could find who could do the dirty work for them. The
Hmm.
actual moving people in and the actual dragging dead bodies out. And they used the Jews themselves to deal with the dead bodies. There were
Yeah.
special crews for that. So the Holocaust, like any large industrial enterprise, any large war enterprise, was organized around technologies of killing. And it was organized for the benefit of the killers, of course. Who else? And out of that came the whole business of this industrialized killing process, not science, not modernity, whatever that
Yeah.
means. Just let's make sure our guys don't break down or worse of
Right.
all, become killers all the time. And that, by the way, then became just to finish,
Sure, sure.
a test of Athens model.
Yeah.
Athens model beautifully described the process whereby these people were moved from ordinary training for combat or police duty into a more brutal kind of killing, and then approached and were complicated by the slaughter that they were being asked to do that was beyond the range of their social experience and therefore led to breakdown of one kind or another.
Wow. This is a a pretty heavy conversation we've had. I want to end on a more positive note. I have two two questions I ask of all my guests at the end of every podcast. I'll put them together and then you can answer in whatever order you please.
Sure.
One is if you have any, I hope you do. What gives you hope for the future? And the second question is, what are five books, fiction, nonfiction, that you would recommend to someone?
Ooh, the second one's a harder one, but for the first, yes. Hope for the future, of course. Not only do I have children and grandchildren, and I think they're just as hopeful as one could possibly hope your grandchildren could be, but you either, I think, toward the end of life, and I'm toward the end of life, I'm 84. I've got maybe 10 to 15 more years if I'm lucky. And I hope I'm lucky. I have another brother that didn't grow up with us who's 94, 10 years older than I am, and he's still kicking. So maybe I'll make it to there. And Ed Wilson, whose biography I
Yeah.
just wrote, E.O. Wilson, is at 92, I think now,
Yeah.
working on what will be his most important book, a book about the whole structure of ecology and how that works in the world. So there's hope that I can write some more books, which I want to, but generally hope. I mean, Ed is hopeful at 92, having seen all these years of everything we've seen in the world. And he's hopeful because he's seen the species manage its problems, maybe clumsily, maybe not only always very well, but get by until
Yeah.
something better comes along, pushed by hope and intelligence and political forces of various kinds, pushed by the fundamental needs of human beings to live and to thrive. So if Ed can take that perspective, it seems to me, I don't want to be one of those old guys, and I'm not one of those old guys who says, we're all going to hell in a handbasket. I don't believe that. And all you have to do is look around you to see it. We may end up wearing silver suits underground in an air-conditioned habitat and coming up to the surface of the earth in boiling temperatures and taking little trips around to look at the life that's evolved with air-conditioned suits itself, you know. but but I think we'll keep going and find a way past that. Ed poses the interesting question: what happens when we solve all these problems and we find that in fact we have no more long-term purpose in life than all the other species of creatures? That will be a spiritual. That I mean, they talked about the death of God back in the post-war existential days. This I don't know what that one will be, but I know I won't be around to see it, so I'm not worried about it.
Mm.
So I do have hope, and I think we should have hope. If you don't have hope, where are you?
Yeah.
I mean, again, to go back to the question of abuse in childhood, the children who didn't have help and something that gave them hope and maybe physical help as well are the ones who didn't make it. They're the ones who became criminals. They're the ones who became mentally ill. They're the ones who developed diseases that were the product of their adverse childhood experiences, a whole new field and a whole new rich knowledge of how humans develop that I was hoping to write a book about because I knew the man who developed the idea, but never was able to find a publisher in New York who was interested, sadly. Anyway, the movement has gone on, and that's another rich aspect of hope as well. Now, books. Well, as an author who answered to the question, how do you get up in the morning and get to your desk and start writing? Who always says, I have a mortgage. Uh, I would love to mention my five of my books, any five, choose your order. I think there's plenty there of variety and interest for anyone who wants to read them. But I mean, my touchstone book in fiction for a long time has been Moby Dick. I'm working on a novel right now, which is not going to be Moby Dick, but it's certainly in that vein. After 40 years of wanting to write some fiction again, I'm actually doing it on the side while I start work on another book of nonfiction. But God knows Moby Dick, Leaves of Grass, one of the great works of American literature, this little tiny collection of poems that Whitman published in 1855, sent a copy to Thoreau, to Emerson, who said, great American poet has come forth among us. It still is the most amazing book to read because it sounds like conversation, but it's just powerful poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And beyond that, I don't know. I'd be hard put just to grab something up. I mean, I've read all my life. So
How about something you've read recently that that just pops to mind that maybe you would recommend? It doesn't have to be your all-time favorites. It's like picking your favorite child, I would imagine. Uh, but 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 something that you recently read and thoroughly enjoyed.
I've had trouble finding anything to read lately.
Really?
Yes. I have trouble reading fiction because I know how it's assembled. So I just notice the gears and wheels rather than jump into the story. Uh, so it's more fun to write fiction for me than to read it, actually,
Mhm.
because it's such play after writing nonfiction, which is, I like to call nonfiction the task of trying to build the Sistine Chapel out of mosaic tile. All these little facts that you have that you want to assemble into this beautiful portrait. Whereas fiction is more like throwing clay. You can shape it any way you want.
Right, right.
It may spin off and go flying, but it's much more amenable to touch and control. I'm not very good at coming up instantly with the names of books. I mean, Dr. Dolittle was a formative book of my childhood. In a way, writing Ed Wilson's biography is going back to that because Ed learned how to talk to ants. He really did. He dissected ants until he found the source of the pheromone that they produce that they use to communicate with each other, and then he'd take a little pheromone and make a trail with it, and the ants would all come running up his trail, and there wouldn't be any food at the end, and they'd all stand around puzzled and bewildered. Why'd you lay that trail if you didn't have any food? So, but, and I'll tell you one book that I reread with great fascination, and that's The Origin of Species. Anyone who has it, or even better, maybe The Voyage of the Beagle, Darwin's book about his voyages down to Patagonia, when he really first kind of caught a glimpse of the ideas that led to his book on evolution. But as science books go, The Origin of Species is easily accessible. It's all written by a good English country gentleman in the best possible English prose. And step by step, he goes through the whole argument. And when at the end, if you're not convinced, then you must be a fundamentalist, is all I can say.
Um,
Those
I
are,
do. Yeah, I do want to say before we wrap up, it's thank you for giving me and the listeners so much of your time. Um, your books have brought me immense joy. Um, I'm sure they brought a lot of other people immense joy. And thank you very much for coming on and speaking with me.
my pleasure. I'm glad we made it happen.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
thank you.
Thank you.